Edward is the same colour as Thomas and the same size as James. He can pull coaches and push trucks. But Edward is old and not as strong as the others. Some engines think this makes him unreliable. Following on from my video discussing my favourite episodes revolving around Thomas, today's video will cover my favourite episode spotlighting Edward the Blue Engine. One thing to note is that unlike my last video, this will be a top 5 as opposed to a top 10, as Edward doesn't have that many standouts. If you enjoy this video and want to see more like it, then don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring Toby's bell to stay notified for when I post new content. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Number 5. Old Reliable Edward. I've praised this episode before, and rightfully so. While it is a little bit tiresome to see Gordon acting like a dick towards Edward this late in the game, I can't argue that this episode is bad, given how well it utilises all 3 of its main characters. Gordon is the typical ungrateful and degrading arsehole, and when Thomas hears about it, he comes up with a plan to put Gordon in his place. He challenges the Big Blue Engine to a race and causes him to get stuck on the hill, which in turn forces Gordon to admit that he was wrong and ask Edward for help. Once more, Edward is finally put in a position of power, which is oh so satisfying to see. As I've said in the past, I also love how the friendship between Thomas and Edward is represented here. Edward is one of the few characters that Thomas fully respects, and thus seeing these two take down the big blue guy is great. Number 4. Edward and Gordon. This one is notable for kicking off the Edward and Gordon rivalry. As the second story of the Railway series and the TV show, it perfectly establishes who Edward is as a character. He's old and outdated, and thus is looked down on for it. But he proves that he is not only more than capable of handling the jobs given to him, but he's also a very determined engine and is willing to help out anyone, even those who are rude to him. Matter of fact, I think that the episode handles this story slightly better than the book, largely because it combines Edward and Gordon with the first story, Edward's Day Out. As a result, we get a nice conclusive arc in the span of a single episode. It's also quite the contrast in tone to the first episode of the show, which was very comedic in its tone, whereas this one is much more grounded and quite frankly has a much more satisfying conclusion. Whereas Gordon and Thomas were complete dicks in the show's debut, this second episode does a complete 180 by introducing us to a character that couldn't be more worthy of respect. A very realistic example of how people can be drastically different to each other in personality, but it also provides the audience with an excellent role model, as Edward is someone who is truly worth aspiring to be like. And all this was established in only the second story of the franchise. Brilliant. Number 3. Saved from scrap. A lot of Edward's episodes are worthy of note for one reason or another, and this time it's because it introduces scrap, or the concept of death. While there have been dark and emotionally distressing undertones before this point, this is where we find out that a character is in fact scheduled to outright die.
They're going to break me up next week.
Of course it does have a happy ending. Edward convinces the Vicar of Wellsworth to buy Trevor, in turn saving his life. There's a lot of world building to this episode. We're introduced to several new characters, as well as a couple of new locations, that being the vicarage and the scrapyard. I know that Trevor has been treated as a bit of a meme within the fandom, which in all honesty is something that I never found funny. He's just an old grandpa figure who enjoys how happy children can brighten up your day, which, to be honest, is really sweet. I also really like the friendship between Edward and Trevor. It's quite frankly underrated and underused in my opinion. Yes, season 3 paired them up a couple of times, but that was about it for the most part. Season 2 was Edward's best season, and this episode definitely reinforces that idea, as not only do we get to see more of the kind-hearted, determined, heroic Edward, but he is also involved in a phenomenon that will be integral to the series' identity moving forward. Number 2. Edward's exploit. It may seem sinful to put this as my number 2, and to be fair, if we were talking about the Railway series stories, then it most likely would have been the number 1. The only real reason that it's not my number 1 is due to the limitations that the showmakers were dealing with at the time, and this resulted in them being very restricted in what they could do with Edward's prop. As such, the situation doesn't appear to be as dire as it does in the original illustrations. Still, it's a fantastic episode. Edward finally gains the respect of the big engines, including Gordon, after achieving the most grandiose of exploits in a situation that would have almost certainly put any other engine down for the count. The music is great, the dark tone is wonderful, and it actually feels conclusive, as the big engines are never rude to Edward again, at least for a few seasons. If I recall correctly, I think Ringo Starr may have said that this was his favourite episode of the show, which is pretty cool. Don't quote me on that though. Regardless of what would happen with Edward years later in the show's lifespan, this episode, and by extension its story, is the perfect way to close Edward's journey in the franchise. This is everything that his stories have built up to. Anyone who knows this story can instantly tell you why it's a great episode. Before we get to what is probably an obvious number 1, I just wanted to give a quick honourable mention to the episode Cows. I did originally have this episode on the list, but in the end I dropped it in favour of Save from Scrap. This is a simple story with some great humour, and it has a satisfying conclusion where old Edward gets yet another one-up on the big pompous Gordon. I also really like Edward, Trevor and the Really Useful Party. It's more of a Trevor focused episode, but I do love the continuity with their friendship and Edward's desire to help others. And my number 1 favourite Edward episode is Old Iron. This is not only my favourite Edward episode, but one of my favourite episodes from the show altogether. To this day, I still get goosebumps whenever I watch the Runaway sequence. It's a really badass scene, with Edward pushing himself to rescue James, despite the Red Engine having been rude to him earlier. It just once again shows what kind of guy Edward really is. Something else that I think is noteworthy about this episode, and something that I've never seen anyone bring up before, is that not only is Edward tiring himself out to rescue James, but it is established earlier in the episode, and in a prior story, that Edward clanks as he goes along.
Edward was getting old, his bearings were worn, and he clanked as he puffed along. He clanks about like a lot of old iron.
We already know that the engines are capable of feeling things like fatigue and pain. As such, I always interpreted Edward's clanking as him effectively limping along the rails, which if that's the case, he's most likely putting himself through physical pain to rescue James. And after all that, he still manages to chuckle and crack a joke.
So the old iron caught you after all, chuckled Edward.
This is one of those episodes where I consider the adaptation to be mostly superior to the book, as we can actually see Edward's fatigued expression on screen, whereas in the book, we don't. It would have been nice to see the big welcome home that Edward gets at the end of the book, but I digress. There are other notable moments of course. I really love the consistency with Thomas and by extension Percy's loyalty to Edward. The old blue engine was the first friend that each of these 2 tank engines had when they initially came to Sodor, and that really shows. I really feel like I should have more to say about my favourite Edward episode, but I can't think of anything else. It, like Edward's debut in the show, perfectly exemplifies just what type of character Edward is. On top of that, it's just very well put together and has a badass action scene. What more could you possibly want from an Edward story? And that should do it. I know that this video was shorter than Thomas's, and to be honest, it could have easily been a top 10 video if we were talking about some of Edward's best moments throughout the show, but this is a video of my favourite episodes starring the Blue Engine, which are a lot harder to come by. As always, I hope you all enjoyed, and I look forward to hearing what your favourite episodes are starring the titular Blue Engine. Naturally, we'll be covering Henry next in this series, who will be getting a top 10, so stay tuned. Now until next time, I've been Cinders and Ashes UK, you've been awesome, and have a great day. Bye!